Welcome to Tales of the Force, soothing science fiction stories inspired by a galaxy far beyond our own. If these tales help you unwind, relax, or drift towards sleep, be sure to like and subscribe. For now, close your eyes, take a slow breath, and let the Force guide you into tonight's story. The Architect of Fear. Cassivar Halton's office occupied sub-level 43 of the Imperial Stability Directorate, where the hum of power conduits formed a constant background whisper that made his teeth ache by midday. No windows. The air tasted of recycled filtration and the faint metallic tang of climate regulators working overtime. Sometimes he caught himself holding his breath without realizing it. He stood before 3 wall-mounted displays, each showing a different sector's compliance indices. The Horus expanse glowed amber, not quite critical, not quite stable. His fingers moved across the haptic interface, pulling up fleet deployment schedules. The interface was slightly warm to the touch, always warm. Senior Architect, the voice came from the doorway. Riom Valsis, Fleet Doctrine Marshal, his uniform pressed to regulation sharpness, the fabric so crisp it looked uncomfortable. His boots made no sound on the rubberized flooring, but Cassivar could smell the cleaning. Solvent. Harsh. Chemical. Recently applied. Cassivar didn't turn. Which sector? Horus. 3 frontier systems. You delayed Star Destroyer Implacable's response window by 72 hours to reallocate it to the Corellian trade corridor. Correct. Cassivar tapped a sequence. A new graph populated, the blue lines ascending with satisfying precision. Rebellion activity ceased within 60 hours. Total Imperial casualties, 0. Local casualties, 47 confirmed, 18 probable. Acceptable loss curve. Riom stepped closer. Cassivar could see his reflection in the polished display surface. Jaw set, eyes tracking the data with the expression of someone doing arithmetic in his head. The rebellion ceased because they ran out of food. Famine indices in those systems are climbing. Piracy reports increased 14%. I have 3 separate garrison commanders requesting emergency medical supplies. Temporary fluctuation. Cassivar pulled up a predictive model, the algorithms running in real time. Within 6 months, stability metrics will normalize. The trade corridor required immediate presence. Core worlds generate 63% of our industrial output. Frontier systems generate 8. Mon Calamari shipyards alone produce more tonnage than the entire Horus sector combined. You're creating martyrs, dead children with names, families that will remember this. I'm managing statistical inevitability. Cassivar finally turned. Riom was older than him by a decade, grey at the temples, a scar along his jaw from some long-ago boarding action. A man who'd seen combat before he'd seen conference rooms. Every rebellion we suppress with fleets teaches the next one how to fight better. Every drawn-out conflict produces sympathizers. Alderaan's relief convoys became recruiting tools. Ryloth's blockade turned moderates into radicals. This policy reduced suppression cost by 31% and decreased engagement duration by half. Riom's jaw tightened. His hand moved to his side where a sidearm would have been during active deployment. Empty air. The Horus colonists weren't soldiers. They were miners, moisture farmers, people who harboured insurgents, who failed to report weapons caches, who chose non-compliance. Cassivar gestured to the displays. The model accounts for secondary effects. Famine reduces population density in contested regions. Lower density reduces organisational capacity. Piracy is a law enforcement issue, not a strategic threat. Would you prefer we station a Star Destroyer in every backwater system? We have 12,000 inhabited worlds, Marshal. We have 25,000 Star Destroyers. Do the arithmetic. Riom stood very still. Outside, through the hermetically sealed walls, Cassivar could hear the distant rumble of a cargo transport on the sub-level rail system. Felt it more than heard it. Vibration through the floor, through his bones. "I'll file a formal objection," Briom said. "That's your prerogative." Marshall left without saluting. The door hissed shut. Cassivar returned to his displays, pulling up the next sector analysis. His reflection stared back from the dark glass between data windows. 42 years old, thin hair already receding, the pallor of someone who hadn't seen natural sunlight in months. He looked away. Cassivar's office notification chimed at 0600 the next morning. He'd been at his desk for 40 minutes already, running simulations on a Bothon sector dispute, drinking caf that had gone cold an hour ago. The taste was bitter, industrial. He drank it anyway. The message header was classified. Priority Alpha. Source: Office of the High Executor. Senior Architect Halton, your clearance has been elevated to Level 7. Report to Central Governance Complex, Tower Sigma, Level 190, at 0800. Attendance is mandatory. Ulbrecht Dornay, High Executor. Level 7 clearance. Cassivar set down his cup, the ceramic making a small sound against the metal desk. Level 7 meant access to strategic deterrence planning, to projects that existed only in whispers and redacted documents. It meant his models had reached the highest evaluation tiers. It meant the Horus decision had been correct, not just operationally, correct, validated by people who saw further than fleet admirals and sector governors. He stood, smoothed his uniform and left for Tower Sigma. In the turbolift, surrounded by other silent bureaucrats rising toward their morning appointments, he caught himself smiling. Tower Sigma's 190th level occupied what had once been a senatorial conference chamber. The original Alderanian oak panelling had been stripped out, replaced with sound-dampening composite panels in regulation grey. The circular table remained, some relic of Republic-era debate. But the seat nameplates were gone, replaced by blank permasteel. Ulbrecht Dornay sat at the table's head, his posture rigid as a Durasteel beam. Mid-60s, silver hair clipped military short, hands folded on the table in front of him with the stillness of someone who had learned to betray nothing through gesture. He had the face of old imperial aristocracy. Sharp angles, the kind of bone structure that looked good in propaganda hollows. Two other figures were present. A woman in an engineering division uniform, insignia marking her as principal rank, and a man in civilian attire with no identifiers at all. The civilian's clothes were expensive but understated, the kind of tailoring that cost a year's salary for a core world administrator but advertised nothing. Senior Architect Halton. Dornay's voice carried the clipped precision of someone who'd spent decades issuing orders and having them followed without question. Each word had edges. You're now authorized to access Project Symbolic Deterrence archives. These archives contain preliminary feasibility studies for alternative pacification methodologies. You will not discuss this clearance with anyone outside this room. Violation carries a mandatory death penalty, enforced immediately upon discovery. Cassivar took the empty seat. The chair was cold. What methodologies? Singular Solutions, Dornay gestured to the woman. Principal Systems Engineer Malis Corthane has completed structural analyses on orbital weapons platforms capable of delivering planetary-scale suppression effects. Malis leaned forward. She was younger than Cassivar expected, mid-30s, with the intensity of someone who'd been solving impossible problems since adolescence. Her hands were stained with something dark around the fingernails, machine oil maybe, or burn residue from testing chambers. The technical parameters are straightforward. Sufficient energy concentration can fracture a planet's crust, overcome gravitational binding energy, render it uninhabitable within hours. We're talking about a hypermatter, reactor 7 kilometers in diameter, channeling approximately 2.4 times 10 to the power of 32 joules through a super laser array with adaptive focusing crystals. The challenge isn't destruction, it's containment and targeting precision at range. Cassivar looked between them. Through the room's sealed door he could hear the muffled rhythm of footsteps in the corridor outside. People going to normal meetings. You're proposing to destroy entire worlds. We're proposing to make destroying worlds a credible capability, Dorney corrected. His fingers drummed once against the table, a single controlled gesture. Your models demonstrate that fleet suppression is inefficient. Every engagement normalizes resistance. The rebellion at Yavin, had it occurred under current doctrine, would have inspired 12 copycat actions within 6 months. But if rebellion knows that certain thresholds trigger total annihilation, not occupation, not suppression, but erasure, rebellion becomes mathematically irrational. The civilian spoke for the first time. His voice was soft, almost gentle, the kind of voice that made you lean in to hear it. Varkesh Maloon, External Auditor. I'm here to ensure this project remains aligned with central authority and free from the institutional drift that crippled the Republic's executive function. Senior Architect, your role would be policy architecture, not engineering, not military deployment. You would design the framework that determines when and how such a capability could be invoked. You would build a doctrine that outlives us all. Cassivar's hands rested flat on the table. The surface was smooth, cold against his palms. How many worlds? Ideally, Dornay said. One. One demonstration, Mylis clarified. She pulled up a holographic display. Technical schematics that meant nothing to Cassivar but looked precise, inevitable. Maximum visibility. Unambiguous cause. The objective is not to create a battlefield weapon. It's to create a psychological constant. Something so terrible that no one dares force its use again. Terror so absolute it becomes theoretical. Cassivar processed the variables. Fleet deployments cost billions. Each engagement tied up resources for months. Insurgencies metastasized across poorly controlled space, each one spawning 3 more. But a weapon that never needed to fire more than once, that changed the entire strategic equation. The mathematics were elegant in their simplicity. What are the acceptable loss parameters? He asked. Dornay slid a data slate across the table. The motion was deliberate, formal, like signing a treaty. Initial projections estimate a demonstration target population between 500 million and 2 billion. Analyst consensus suggests that lower populations fail to generate sufficient deterrent impact. Higher populations risk galactic-scale backlash that could destabilize the very order we're attempting to preserve. Cassivar picked up the slate. The numbers were there. Casualty projections cross-referenced with economic impact assessments, rebellion suppression curves, projected stability indices for the decade following demonstration. Someone had already run the models. They'd run them thoroughly. The data was clean, defensible, elegant. How many lives does a prolonged civil war cost? Dornay asked quietly. His eyes were grey, unblinking. How many systems descend into famine when trade routes collapse? How many children, Twi'lek children, human children doesn't matter, die in pirate raids because we couldn't maintain security across 10,000 parsecs of frontier space with finite resources? The question hung in the recycled air. Somewhere in the building's infrastructure, a climate regulator cycled with a distant hum. We're not choosing death, Dornay continued. We're choosing fewer deaths. You understand this better than anyone. Your consolidation policy saved more lives than it cost. 65 fewer deaths from piracy in the Corellian corridor in the first quarter alone. This is the same logic, applied at scale. Applied with the courage to follow calculation to its conclusion. Cassivar looked at the slate again. The models were elegant, clean, defensible. They felt true the way mathematics felt true, independent of emotion or sentiment or the way things felt when you were close enough to see faces. "I'll need unrestricted access to Imperial strategic databases," he said. His voice sounded distant, professional, including classified rebellion suppression case studies, long-term instability projections, and economic modelling for sector collapse scenarios. "Granted," Dornay said immediately. "Effective immediately." Varkesh Malun watched Cassivar with unblinking attention, his expression perfectly neutral. "Welcome to the project, Senior Architect. You've taken the first step toward preventing the next galactic war." The meeting adjourned. Cassivar returned to his office and began reviewing the archives, pulling up case study after case study of rebellions that could have been prevented, civil wars that could have been averted, famines that emerged from power vacuums that a stronger hand could have filled. The data supported the conclusion. It always had. Riom Valtis's formal objection had been filed that morning at 0547. It had been classified as pre-implementation noise and archived without response in a subdirectory Cassivar would never see. The rejection was automated. No human being had read it. 6 weeks into the project, Cassivar submitted his preliminary framework to the High Executor's office. The document was 43 pages, supported by 218 pages of statistical appendices drawn from 3 decades of Imperial strategic data. The core proposal: establish a singular deterrence doctrine, one weapon, one demonstration, permanent compliance. He defined acceptable target criteria with algorithmic precision, populations large enough to generate deterrent impact, minimum threshold 500 million, infrastructure dense enough to be visible across hyperspace communication networks, minimum Class 3 spaceport infrastructure, political significance sufficient to resonate across multiple sectors, minimum 3 adjacent systems with historical trade ties. He outlined escalation thresholds, what level of rebellion would justify activation. He proposed oversight mechanisms, a 3-tier approval process requiring sign-off from civilian, military and executive authorities, with mandatory 30-day waiting periods and independent verification of target criteria. The framework was designed to constrain abuse while preserving effectiveness. He believed it was the minimum necessary structure to prevent the weapon from becoming routine. A weapon used once was deterrence. A weapon used repeatedly was genocide. Dornay approved it within 72 hours. Malis. Courtaine received authorization to proceed with Phase 2 engineering studies. The project designation changed from symbolic deterrence to something more direct: planetary suppression asset. In the corridors of Tower Sigma, people started calling it something else, whispered in quiet corners, never in official communications, the Death Star. Cassivar met with Maelis in her laboratory complex, buried 12 levels beneath the engineering sector, in what had once been a Republic-era weapons testing facility. The space was vast, cathedral-like, filled with holographic projection arrays showing schematics that stretched from floor to ceiling. The air smelled different here: ozone and heated metal, and the acrid bite of welding flux. He could hear machinery in the distance, the deep bass rumble of something massive being tested. "Your framework defines targeting parameters," Maelis said without preamble. She didn't look at him, her attention fixed on a rotating schematic of what looked like a concave focusing dish kilometers across. "But it doesn't specify weapon yield. That's a technical question with policy implications. We can't design until we know what you want to achieve." She gestured, and a planetary cross-section appeared in the air between them, cutaway layers showing crust, mantle, core. Terran standard planet, probably Earth-sized. "We can design for surface sterilization, total atmospheric dispersal, or complete structural disintegration. Each option has different deterrent profiles and different resource requirements." "What do you recommend?" Cassivar asked. "Complete disintegration." She said it the way someone might recommend a particular alloy specification. Clinical, optimal. Cassivar studied the simulation. The planet rotated slowly, peaceful, blue-green, alive. Why? Ambiguity breeds hope. Malis rotated the hologram with a hand gesture, zooming into the planet's surface. Cities, roads, the geometric patterns of civilization. If a world remains intact but lifeless, survivors can imagine reclamation. Archaeological teams can recover artifacts. Families can visit graves. Martyrs have monuments. The Jedi Temple on Coruscant still stands, and people still visit it, still remember what it represented. Memory is infrastructure for resistance. She made a sharp gesture, and the planet fractured into debris. The simulation was detailed. Cassivar could see cities shattering, oceans boiling into space, the crust peeling apart along tectonic boundaries. But if the planet itself ceases to exist, if it becomes an asteroid field, dust and rubble scattered across an orbital radius, there's nothing left to rally around. No monument, no memory, no coordinates in hyperspace that mean anything except absence. You can't make a pilgrimage to nothing. You can't tell stories about a place that isn't a place anymore. She rotated the hologram. The fragments scattered outward, dispersing. This is clarity. This is deterrence without ambiguity. The threat becomes self-evident. Rebellion against us doesn't merely risk death. It risks erasure from the galaxy itself. Not just you. Everything you built, everyone you knew, the rocks you walked on, gone. Cassivar watched the fragments scatter, felt something shift in his chest. Not horror exactly. Recognition. Malis was right. Partial measures created narratives, and narratives created movements. Total annihilation created silence. Vacuum. Nothing for mythology to cling to. The psychological impact would be absolute, he said. Correct, and it prevents escalation. Malis dismissed the hologram with a gesture that looked almost impatient. A wounded planet invites rescue operations, humanitarian aid, political opportunism. Every relief convoy becomes a platform for speeches about imperial brutality. But a non-existent planet invites nothing. The conversation ends. There's no footage of survivors to show on rebel propaganda networks. No refugees to interview. Just silence and a debris field. And after a few years, people won't even remember to avoid that sector. It'll just be empty space that used to be something. Cassivar felt the logic settle into place like tumblers in a lock. I'll amend the framework to specify planet terminal yield. Good. Malis pulled up another schematic, this one showing power conduits snaking through a spherical structure, kilometres of them, glowing in cross-section like a nervous system. We'll need approximately 8 years for construction. The power requirements alone, we're talking about channeling enough energy to overcome a planet's gravitational binding force. That's 10 to the power of 32 joules. For comparison, that's more energy than our sun outputs in a week, delivered in approximately 8 seconds. We're designing something that's never existed. A mobile star fortress with the capacity to destroy creation itself. Her voice didn't change. Still clinical, still precise. But Cassivar caught something in her eyes, not excitement exactly, pride. The pride of an engineer solving an impossible problem. Can it be done? Yes, but not quietly. Construction will require labour on a scale that draws attention. Penal conscription from a dozen sectors. Frontier resource extraction that will drain 3-star systems of raw materials. Classified supply chains that will redirect 17% of Imperial industrial output. We'll need a logistics coordinator with experience managing sensitive operations and the moral flexibility to maintain production schedules under difficult conditions. I'll recommend someone to Dornay, Cassivar said. Make sure they understand the stakes. We're on a timeline. Every month of delay is another month for leaks to spread, for the rebellion to organise, and if they destroy this weapon before it's operational... She didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Cassivar nodded. I'll find someone. Jasathoran arrived at Central Governance 3, weeks later, summoned from his administrative post in the Horus Expanse. Cassivar met him in a secure briefing room. No windows, sound isolated, access logged and monitored. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant. Too clean, like they'd scrubbed something out of it recently. Jasoth was thin, weathered, his uniform slightly faded at the edges, regulation tan that had gone pale from too many launderings under a desert sun. Frontier service showed in the set of his shoulders, the way his eyes tracked every exit, the scar tissue on his hands from years handling equipment in unshielded environments. He was 43 but looked older. Sun damage, probably, and stress. Administrator Orum, Cassivar began, your performance metrics in penal labour management exceed sector averages by 22%. You maintain quota compliance while minimising operational disruption. Your mortality rates are below sector standard. Your requisition efficiency is exemplary. These are rare. Qualities. I do my job. Jasoth's voice was flat, carefully flat. The voice of someone who'd learned that emotion complicated things. He sat very still, hands folded on the table. You're being reassigned to a classified construction project. Material procurement, labour allocation, supply chain coordination. The scale will be unprecedented. Nothing like this has been attempted since the first Star Destroyers. Your performance will determine the timeline. Success is mandatory. Failure is career-ending. What am I building? A deterrent. Cassivar slid a data slate across the table. The motion felt rehearsed, formal. Details are compartmentalised. You'll receive operational parameters on site. Refusal is not an option, but successful completion carries significant career advancement. Core world posting, administrative track. You'll never have to see a frontier world again. Jasoth picked up the slate. His eyes scanned the preliminary requirements. Labour force projections in the hundreds of thousands, material tonnage in the millions, construction duration measured in years, industrial equipment rated for deep space, hazard pay calculations that assumed significant attrition. His throat moved, a swallow, convulsive. This will kill people, he said quietly. All large-scale construction carries risk, Cassivar replied. The script felt familiar now. Your role is to minimise inefficiency. Mortality rates above sector standard will trigger investigation. Below standard will be rewarded. You have extensive experience managing acceptable losses. This is no different, just larger. Jasoth looked at him for a long moment. His eyes were brown, bloodshot at the corners. Tired eyes. The eyes of someone who'd already seen things they couldn't talk about. When do I leave? Tomorrow. A shuttle will collect you at 0600. Packlight. Everything you need will be provided on site. You won't be returning to Horus. Jasoth set the slate down. His fingers left marks. On its surface. Dust. Oil. The residue of frontier worlds. Understood. After he left, Cassivar sat alone in the briefing room for a moment, listening to the climate control system cycle. He thought about Jasoth's hands, about the way the man had looked at the casualty projections without flinching. The right person for the job, experienced, competent, morally flexible. Cassivar filed the meeting report and moved on to the next appointment. Construction began in a remote system designated only by coordinates. K9738. No planets with registered names, no traffic, no habitation. The primary planet was lifeless, irradiated by an ancient stellar event, geologically dead, atmosphere long since stripped away by solar wind. Perfect for concealment, perfect for work that needed to remain invisible. Orbital scaffolding rose like skeletal fingers, visible from the surface as a dark lattice against the stars. Transport ships arrived daily, disgorging prisoners and materials and equipment. The noise was constant, metal on metal, the shriek of cutting torches, the deep bass thrum of artificial gravity generators coming online. Cassivar visited the site once, 6 months into construction. The shuttle descent was turbulent. Something about the planet's magnetic field, or maybe just the mass of orbital structures disrupting local space. Through the viewport he could see it taking shape, the skeleton of something impossible, a sphere hundreds of kilometers in diameter, already dwarfing the star destroyers that guarded its construction. Jasseth met him at the orbital transfer station. His face was thinner than before, shadows under his eyes, a tremor in his left hand that he tried to hide. The station smelled like recycled air and unwashed bodies and something else. Ozone, maybe, or the particular stink of fear in enclosed spaces. Progress is on schedule, Jasseth reported. His voice had developed a monotone quality, rehearsed. Current labour force, 247,000. Attrition rate, 4.1% per quarter, within acceptable parameters. Material throughput exceeding projections by 7%. We've resolved the primary power coupling issues. Melis's team says we're ready for reactor installation. Good. Cassivar looked out at the construction through the station's viewport. The weapon's skeletal frame was beginning to take shape. A sphere, massive beyond comprehension, its surface studded with what would become weapons emplacements, shield generators, power conduits thick as buildings. It didn't look like a weapon. It looked like a moon, like something that had always existed and always would. We've had 3 escape attempts, Jasseth continued. His voice didn't change pitch. All intercepted. 2 groups were returned to labour with disciplinary action. One was dealt with, executed. Standard protocol for security breaches on classified projects. 17 prisoners total. Public. Execution. Full labour force required to witness. It reduced subsequent escape attempts to 0. Jasseth's face was blank when he said it. Completely blank, like a mask. Cassivar recognised the expression, had seen it in his own reflection after certain meetings. The face you wore when you did things you couldn't afford to think about. Maintain operational security, Cassivar said. The project's existence must remain contained until completion. Any breach, any leak, compromises the entire strategic objective. Do whatever is necessary. Understood. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the construction. Thousands of tiny figures in pressure suits, crawling over the superstructure like insects on a carcass. From this distance, you couldn't tell they were human. Just shapes, movement, function. How long can you maintain this pace? Cassivar asked. Jasseth's jaw tightened. As long as necessary. Good. The timeline is non-negotiable. Every delay increases the risk of discovery. The Emperor himself is aware of this project. Disappointing him is not an option. I understand. On the shuttle back to the core worlds, Cassivar reviewed Jasseth's detailed reports. Mortality rates were actually below the acceptable threshold by 0.3%. Labour productivity exceeded initial projections. Supply chain efficiency was remarkable. The administrator was performing exceptionally under conditions that would have broken most people. He filed a commendation in Jasseth's personnel record. The man deserved recognition. Rion Valsis requested a meeting 18 months into construction. Cassivar almost denied it. The Marshal had no direct involvement in the project, no clearance, no need to know. But curiosity won out, and something else. The memory of their last conversation, perhaps. The way Rayom had looked at him. They met in a neutral conference room. No recording devices per Rayom's request, no observers. The room was small, anonymous, a kind of space reserved for conversations that needed to be deniable. It smelled like cleaning solvent and the recycled air of a building that never slept. "I know what you're building," Riom said without preamble. He looked older, more grey, a new scar above his left eye, recent, still pink. Cassivar kept his expression neutral. "Your clearance doesn't authorise—" "Don't." Riom's voice was sharp enough to cut. "Fleet logistics doesn't work in a vacuum. When entire Star Destroyer complements get reassigned to convoy escort duty for classified construction materials, people notice. When veteran engineering crews disappear into black site rotations and don't come back, people talk. When I requisition parts for fleet maintenance and get told 17% of industrial output is currently classified, I do arithmetic. I've been in this military long enough to recognise a weapons project, and I know what kind of weapon requires this much secrecy and this much mass. Then you understand." "It's necessity," Cassivar said. "I understand you're building something that makes fleets obsolete, something that concentrates all our strategic capability into a single asset. That's not deterrence. That's dependency. And dependency is vulnerability." "Dependency on what?" "On fear." Riom leaned forward, his knuckles white against the table edge. "Right now, the Empire governs through presence. Fleets patrol, garrisons occupy, administrators manage. People see power everywhere, distributed, constant. My ships keep trade routes open. They respond to piracy. They show the flag. That's governance. But if you centralise that power into one weapon, what happens when that weapon becomes the only thing holding the Empire together?" "Then rebellion becomes impossible," Cassivar replied. "Which is the objective." "No." Riom's voice dropped to something dangerous. "Then the Empire becomes the weapon. Every decision, every policy, every response gets filtered through the question, will we use it? And once you use it, once you prove you're willing to annihilate worlds, you can't go back. The threat stops being abstract. It becomes a promise. And promises must be kept, or they lose all meaning, so you'll use it again and again, until using it is the only language the Empire speaks." Cassivar stood. "This meeting is over." "It should be designed to fire once," Riom said, as Cassivar reached the door. "Maximum deterrence, minimum normalization. If you build something meant to be used repeatedly, it will be. Fear only works when it remains theoretical. The moment it becomes routine, the moment people see it as policy instead of catastrophe, you've lost, and everyone loses." Cassivar paused, his hand on the door control. "Your concern is noted." "Is it? Or will it get filed as pre-implementation noise and archived without response?" Cassivar didn't answer. He left without looking back. That night, alone in his office at 0300, Cassivar pulled up the weapons. Specifications: maximum firing capacity, unlimited pending power core recharge cycles of approximately 24 standard hours, theoretical maximum targets per standard year, 365, one per day, every day, forever. He stared at that number for a long time, tried to imagine what it would mean. 365 worlds, 365 civilizations, trillions of lives, reduced to debris fields and empty coordinates in hyperspace. He amended his framework, added a section on usage constraints, recommended that activation be limited to existential threats only, defined as organized rebellion, encompassing more than 5 sectors, or the verified existence of a rival superweapon, recommended that each firing require unanimous approval from a standing review board of 9 senior officials, with mandatory 90-day waiting periods and independent verification of target criteria by separate intelligence agencies. He spent 4 hours on it, made it airtight, made it defensible, made it something that could preserve the weapon's deterrent value while preventing its routine use. He filed the amendment and returned to his other work, satisfied that he'd done the right thing. The amendment was classified as advisory opinion, and archived without incorporation into operational doctrine. The automated response was instantaneous. No human being reviewed it. The filing system had been designed that way, to process suggestions without implementing them, to create the illusion of oversight without the inconvenience of constraint. Cassivar never checked whether it had been implemented. He assumed it had been. Why wouldn't it be? The logic was sound. Year 6 of construction. The weapon-designated planetary suppression asset, though everyone called it the Death Star now, openly, in memos and briefings, achieved structural completion. Malus Corthane's engineering teams began power system integration. The reactor cores came online one by one, each test firing illuminating the construction site like a newborn star. Cassivar received weekly progress reports, each one confirming what the projections had always promised. The weapon would function exactly as designed, better even. Malus had exceeded specifications. The focusing array was more precise than initially modelled. The power output was 12% above minimum requirements. He sat in his office, reviewing activation protocols when his secure terminal chimed. The sound made him flinch. He'd been staring at spreadsheets for 6 hours straight, and his eyes ached. The message header made him straighten. Immediate review required. Deterrence timeline acceleration. The meeting convened within hours. Tower Sigma, level 190. The same room where it had begun 6 years ago. Ulbrich Dornay looked older. The lines around his eyes had deepened, carved in like erosion. His hair had gone completely silver. He looked like a man who hadn't slept well in months. Intelligence reports indicate that knowledge of the project has leaked. Not specifics, but enough. Enough that certain systems are becoming preemptively defiant. Which systems? Cassivar asked. 17 in the Outer Rim, 8 in the Mid-Territories, Mon Calamari, Sulust, Bothawui. The major industrial worlds are forming what they're calling a defensive pact. Rebellion activity is intensifying. They believe, correctly, that once the weapon is operational, their window for effective resistance closes. So they're accelerating, coordinating. Mon Calamari shipyards have tripled output. Sullust is manufacturing weapons openly. They're not even pretending anymore. Varkesh Maloon spoke from his usual position at the table's far end. He looked exactly the same as 6 years ago, unchanged, as if time didn't touch him. The leak created exactly what we sought to prevent, organised resistance while we remain vulnerable. If the Death Star is destroyed before it fires, the strategic consequences are catastrophic. We lose the weapon, we lose the deterrent, and we validate the strategy of preemptive action. Every system will feel emboldened to strike first. We should delay activation, Cassivar said immediately. The words came automatically defensive. Implement graduated disclosure protocols. Let systems understand the weapon's purpose through controlled channels, official announcements, diplomatic briefings, time for rationality to prevail, reduce panic, allow time for... Delay amplifies the problem. Malus's voice cut through the room like a laser. She looked tired. Her eyes were bloodshot, her uniform rumpled. She'd clearly come directly from the construction site. Graduated disclosure means prolonged uncertainty. Uncertainty breeds exactly the kind of desperate action we're seeing. If systems believe they have time, they'll use it to organise, to build weapons, to coordinate strikes. The Mon Calamari are already constructing capital ships designed to target station-scale vulnerabilities. We've intercepted the schematics. They're building a fleet specifically to destroy the Death Star. Then we implement comprehensive security, increase the defensive perimeter, add more Star Destroyer escorts. Security failed, Varkesh interrupted. His voice was soft, patient, like explaining something to a child. The leak occurred. The variable we cannot control is time. Systems now know something exists. Partial knowledge is more destabilizing than complete revelation. It invites speculation, paranoia, worst-case thinking. Graduated disclosure simply extends the period of maximum danger while giving our enemies time to prepare. Every day we wait strengthens their position and weakens ours. Cassivar looked between them, felt the walls of the room closing in, even though the dimensions hadn't changed. "You're proposing immediate deployment." "Immediate demonstration," Dorne corrected. His hands were folded on the table, fingers interlaced. "Steady." The weapon is functional. Power systems integration is complete enough for a single firing. We select a target, one of the systems actively organising resistance, and we end the uncertainty. Clean, decisive, immediate compliance across all sectors. No more speculation, no more escalation, just clarity. "We're not ready." Cassivar's voice sounded strange in his own ears, desperate. The oversight framework isn't implemented. The review board doesn't exist. The legal justification, the 90-day waiting period, the independent verification, the unanimous approval requirement. "The legal justification is emergency executive authority," Dorne said, "which has existed since the Empire's founding, codified in the Emergency Powers Act ratified by the Senate before its dissolution. Your framework was advisory, useful for normal operations, but this situation is not normal. This is an existential threat to Imperial stability." Cassivar felt something crystallize in his chest, cold, hard, like ice forming. "Then why am I here?" "To confirm target selection parameters," Varkesh said. "Your models defined acceptable criteria, population thresholds, infrastructure requirements, political significance. We need verification that our chosen target meets them. We need your professional assessment." A holographic display activated in the centre of the table. A world appeared, blue-green, beautiful, oceans and continents visible from orbit. Text scrolled beside it. Mon Cala, Dak. Population, 2.7 billion, mixed Mon Calamari and Quarren. Primary export, starship components, heavy industry. Current status, actively arming neighbouring systems, coordinating defensive pact, harbouring confirmed Rebel Alliance cells. Large enough to matter, Malis observed. Her voice was clinical, detached. Economically significant enough to be noticed. Their shipyard supply 17% of the Rebel fleet. Politically active enough to justify action. They've been organising resistance for 2 years. It meets all your criteria. Actually, it exceeds them. This is the optimal target by every metric you defined. Cassivar stared at the planet. 2.7 billion people. The Mon Calamari were a civilized species. Artists, philosophers, shipbuilders. Their cities were beautiful, built in harmony with the oceans. Their ships were works of art as much as tools of war. Families, children, infrastructure built over millennia. Culture, history, everything that made a world and not just a mass of rock and water, all about to become an acceptable loss curve. "If we wait," Dorne said quietly, "how many more systems will Mon Cala arm? How many fleets will we lose in prolonged conflict? How many billions die in the chaos of collapse if the Empire fragments? If the Death Star is destroyed before it fires, what happens to order, to stability, to the infrastructure that keeps trillions alive?" The numbers rose unbidden in Cassivar's mind. He'd run these projections 1,000 times. Prolonged civil war, estimated casualties in the hundreds of billions over 2 decades. Societal collapse, trillions at risk of famine, disease, violence as trade networks failed, and systems descended into warlordism. Against those numbers, 2.7 billion became necessary. a calculated sacrifice that prevented greater harm. Preventative medicine on a galactic scale. The trolley problem rendered in solar masses and population statistics. Does it meet the criteria? Varkesh asked. His eyes were fixed on Cassivar, unblinking, waiting. Cassivar's voice came from somewhere distant. Yes. The word hung in the air. Final. Irrevocable. Good. Dorne stood, the motion sharp, decisive. Activation is scheduled for 36 hours from now. Malis, confirm final readiness and coordinate with Station Command. Varkesh, coordinate intelligence suppression. I want communication blackouts in adjacent sectors. Nothing gets out until after the demonstration. Cassivar, prepare the documentation for post-event analysis. We'll need comprehensive compliance data within 72 hours of firing. The meeting adjourned. Cassivar sat in the empty conference room for 5 minutes after everyone else had left. The hologram of Mon Cala still rotated slowly in the centre of the table. He watched it spin, watched the Terminator line move across the surface, marking the boundary between day and night. Right now, on that world, the sun was rising over the eastern continents. People were waking up, going to work, making breakfast, arguing about trivial things, living. 36 hours. He reached out and deactivated the hologram. The world vanished. Just empty air where something had been. He stood and left the room. Cassivar didn't sleep that night. He sat at his desk, pulling up every alternative analysis he could construct. Blockade scenarios. How long would it take to starve Mon Cala into submission? 12 months, minimum, with significant civilian casualties and no guarantee of compliance. Targeted leadership strikes, orbital bombardment of government centres, precise destruction of military infrastructure. But the Mon Calamari government was distributed, resistant to decapitation strikes, and partial measures would be interpreted as weakness. Economic sanctions, cut them off from imperial trade networks, watch their economy collapse. But they were already building for independence, and sanctions took years to bite. Every model returned the same conclusion. Partial measures would be interpreted as weakness. Systems would see restraint as opportunity. The rebellion would spread. Half measures killed more people over time. The mathematics were inescapable. At 0300, Riom Valsis appeared in his doorway. No announcement, no authorization. Just standing there, uniform rumpled, expression haggard. He looked like he'd aged 10 years. They're really going to do it, Riom said. Cassivar didn't ask how he knew. The models support it. Fuck your models! Riom stepped inside, letting the door close behind him. The sound was soft, final. 2.7 billion people. You're talking about 2.7 billion people like they're a rounding error, like they're numbers on a spreadsheet instead of... His voice cracked. Instead of people, living people, sentient beings with families and dreams, and they're a calculated loss that prevents a larger one. You keep telling yourself that, but once that weapon fires, you know what happens. The Empire doesn't become stable, it becomes dependent on the willingness to annihilate worlds. Every crisis, every challenge, every moment of defiance, the solution becomes obvious. Use the weapon, because we've proven we will, and if we stop using it, we look weak, so we have to keep using it. Again and again, until it's not a weapon anymore, it's policy, it's Tuesday. Then systems will comply, Cassivar said. Which is the objective? No, Riom's voice was raw. Then systems will obey out of terror, not respect, not shared interest, not because they believe in what we're building. Terror, pure terror. And the moment that terror falters, the moment someone thinks they can survive or find something worse than death, or just stops caring, the entire structure collapses. You can't build a civilization on fear. It doesn't work. It's never worked in the entire history of sentient species. Cassivar met his eyes, saw something there that looked like grief. What would you do? Rion was silent for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I don't know, but I know that once you cross this line, you can't uncross it. And I know that building a government on genocide doesn't end well. It never has. Every empire that tried, the Sith, the Rakata, the Tianese, they all fell. They all burned. Because you can't sustain something that requires constant atrocity to function. Eventually the people willing to commit atrocities run out, or the people willing to tolerate them do, and then it's over. The decision is made. Then we're all complicit. You, me, everyone who knew and did nothing. Everyone who filed reports and signed orders and kept the machine running. Riom turned to leave. At the door he paused. History won't forget this, assuming there's anyone left to write it. Assuming the Death Star doesn't eventually become the only historian that matters, the one that erases inconvenient truths by erasing the worlds that remember them. He left. The door whispered shut. Cassivar returned to his models, ran the numbers again, and again, and again, searching for a different conclusion. The numbers didn't change. They never changed. The numbers still supported the action. They always had. Mathematics didn't care about tears or screams or the sound a child makes when they realise they're going to die. Mathematics was pure, clean, defensible. He built his career on mathematics, on models that predicted outcomes with statistical precision, on frameworks that optimised for efficiency and stability. The models had never been wrong before. 36 hours. The weapon designated the Death Star achieved firing position at the edge of the Mon Calamari system. Cassivar monitored from his office via secure transmission. He had not been invited to the command centre, and he hadn't asked why. The tactical feed showed the planet from high orbit. Cities glowed against dark continents. Orbital traffic moved in regular patterns. Civilian transports, cargo haulers, pleasure craft. Life continuing, unaware. The planet was beautiful. More beautiful than the hollows had suggested. You could see the coral reefs from orbit, pale threads against the deep ocean blue. He could hear audio from the Death Star's bridge, patched through his terminal. Voices, calm and professional. All stations report ready. Super laser charged to full power. Target lock confirmed. Mon Calamari Planetary Center coordinates verified. Standing by for firing authorization. A pause. Then Dorne's voice, clear and steady. Authorization granted. Fire when ready. The countdown reached 0. The weapon fired. The beam was visible for 7.2 seconds. A column of coherent light punching through space, so bright it overwhelmed the visual sensors. Then the planet began to fracture. The crust separated along fault lines, continental plates rising and falling like waves. Oceans vaporized in expanding clouds of steam. The atmosphere stripped away in a visible wave, ionizing as it went. The core destabilized, magma erupting through fissures kilometers wide. Within 4 minutes, Moncala no longer existed, just a debris field expanding outward, chunks of rock and ice, and the fragments of everything that had once been civilization. Estimated particle count, irrelevant. Estimated survivors, 0. Someone was sobbing. Cassivar realized it was him. He stopped, closed his eyes, controlled his breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Center yourself. This was necessary. This was prevention. This was 2.7 billion deaths that saved hundreds of billions. The mathematics were correct. The models had never lied. His terminal chimed. Message from Ulbrecht Dorne. Compile compliance data. Report due in 72 hours. Well done. Cassivar opened a new document. His hands were steady now, breathing controlled. He began typing. The compliance data was extraordinary. Within 24 hours of Moncala's annihilation, Rebellion activity across 16 systems ceased entirely. Organised resistance networks collapsed. Weapons caches were voluntarily surrendered. Sector governors reported compliance levels exceeding 99.7%. Systems that had been actively planning secession sent delegations to Coruscant pledging renewed loyalty. The Mon Calamari diaspora, millions scattered across 100 worlds, went silent. No protests, no revenge attacks, just silence. They understood the message. One more word and another world dies. Cassivar's report documented the success in precise detail. 2,741,638,094 confirmed deaths. Estimated prevention of 127 billion casualties over the following decade. Net deterrence value, positive by multiple orders of magnitude. Rebellion suppression efficiency, unprecedented. Cost per prevented death, lower than any alternative methodology in Imperial history. The numbers were clean, defensible, correct. The report was classified as Priority Alpha and distributed to all sector governance offices. The message was clear. Resistance was no longer a viable strategy. The Empire could erase you. Not just kill you, erase you. Make it so you'd never existed at all. Cassivar received a commendation from the High Executor's office. His clearance was elevated to level 8. He was invited to brief the Inner Council on long-term stability projections. There was talk of a promotion, core world posting, recognition at the highest levels. The galaxy was quieter than it had been in decades. The Death Star moved slowly through hyperspace, its existence now public knowledge, its capabilities now demonstrated beyond any doubt. It didn't need to fire again. Its mere existence was sufficient. Deterrence was working. 3 weeks after the demonstration, Cassivar was summoned to a different office, not Tower Sigma, a smaller complex buried deep in the administrative sector, in a building he'd never entered before. The corridors were narrow, utilitarian. No one he passed made eye contact. Varkesh Maloon waited inside a room that was bare except for a single desk and 2 chairs. The walls were grey composite. The lighting was harsh, institutional. It felt like an interrogation room. "Senior Architect," Varkesh said. "Please sit." Cassivar sat. The chair was uncomfortable, deliberately so. "What is this about?" "Your new assignment." Varkesh slid a data slate across the desk. The motion was precise, controlled. The weapon's existence is now public knowledge. Maintaining its deterrent value requires careful narrative management. You will oversee the symbol maintenance office. Cassivar picked up the slate. The assignment details were sparse, vague. No strategic modelling, no policy architecture, no framework design. Just documentation, archive management, ensuring the official records reflected approved interpretations, reviewing academic analyses of the Mon Cala demonstration and flagging deviations from the official narrative, compiling compliance metrics to justify future activations. "This isn't a strategic position," he said slowly. "No," Varkesh agreed. He folded his hands on the desk, mirroring Dorne's gesture from weeks ago. "The strategy is complete. The weapon exists. The demonstration succeeded. What remains is maintenance, ensuring that no one questions the necessity, that no one compiles alternative analyses, that the official narrative remains consistent, that when we fire again, and we will fire again, despite your advisory recommendations about single-use deterrence, the justification is already prepared. You're archiving me. I'm recognizing that your utility was in the design phase. We no longer need architects. We need maintenance personnel, bureaucrats, record keepers. You designed a system. Now you'll maintain its legitimacy." Varkesh's expression was completely neutral, empty. You should be proud. Your work succeeded beyond all projections. The Empire is stable. Rebellion is mathematically irrational. Your models proved correct. You were right. Doesn't that feel good? Being right? Cassivar looked at the slate again. Symbol Maintenance Office. Sub-level 67. No direct reports. No policy authority. No access to strategic planning. Just a desk and an archive. And an endless stream of documents that needed to be verified, corrected, aligned with approved narratives. "When do I start?" he asked quietly. "Immediately. Your office is prepared. Your access credentials have been updated. Your previous clearances remain active for archival purposes, but you no longer have authorization to submit policy recommendations or attend strategic planning sessions." Varkesh stood, dismissed. Cassivar walked through the corridors of the administrative sector, following the directions on his data slate. Sub-level 67 was deeper than he'd ever worked before. The air was colder here, the lighting dimmer. He passed door after door, each one marked with a department designation he'd never heard of. Historical compliance, narrative integration, truth reconciliation. His office was small. One desk, one terminal, no windows. The walls were the same grey composite as the interrogation room. A stack of data slates waited on the desk, each one requiring review and verification. He sat down and started working. Jasseth Oren's final report from the construction site arrived 2 months later. Cassivar read it in his new office, the words blurring together after the first few pages. Final labour force, 183,429. Total attrition, 68,751 over 8 years. Final mortality rate, 37.5%. Construction completed on schedule and under budget. Commendation recommended for Administrator Oren for exceptional performance under difficult conditions. Jasseth had been reassigned. His new position, Assistant Resource Coordinator, Internal Revenue Processing, Core Administrative District. A desk job, no field authority, no access to classified projects, no interaction with prisoners or labour management, just numbers in a database, taxes and tariffs and trade statistics. The last line of the report was personal, not included in the official submission. "I dream about their faces, every night. The ones who died. I thought it would stop after the project ended. It hasn't stopped." Cassivar filed the report in the appropriate archive section, flagged the personal note for deletion, moved on to the next document. He didn't dream about faces. He saw numbers. Clean, precise, defensible numbers. 2.7 billion. 127 billion prevented. The mathematics remained correct. Riom Valsis was removed from active duty 6 weeks after the Moncala demonstration. The official reason: failure to adapt doctrinal frameworks to evolving strategic realities. His replacement was 32 years old, a true believer who'd risen through the ranks during the post-Clone Wars reorganization. Someone who'd never known the Republic, who'd been trained from the beginning to see problems as requiring singular, decisive solutions. Someone who understood that fleets were support elements now, not primary instruments. The New Fleet Doctrine Marshal immediately drafted integration protocols for coordinating fleet movements with the Death Star's operational windows. The Empire's military strategy formally shifted. Star Destroyers became escort vessels. The doctrine was clear: locate, suppress, prepare for primary weapon deployment if necessary. Riom accepted a teaching position at a minor naval academy in the Inner Rim. Cassivar heard he'd lasted 3 semesters before resigning. After that, nothing. No forwarding address, no updates in his personnel file, just an archived record that ended mid-sentence, as if the man had simply stopped existing. Cassivar never tried to contact him. There was nothing to say. Riom had been wrong about dependency. The Death Star hadn't made the Empire weak. It had made it efficient, clean, Stable. The numbers proved it. Maelis Corthane received the Empire's highest civilian honour for technical achievement. Her engineering methodology became the template for all future strategic weapons development. She was promoted to Director of Advanced Systems and given unlimited resources. Rumour said she was already designing a second Death Star, larger and more powerful than the first. Cassivar saw her once more at a mandatory briefing on system maintenance protocols 14 months after the demonstration. She nodded to him across the conference room. Professional acknowledgement, nothing more. Her eyes were clear, rested. She looked younger than she had during construction, as if a weight had been lifted. She presented her findings with the same clinical precision she'd always had, spoke about power coupling efficiency and super-laser alignment tolerances and the projected operational lifespan of the current Death Star, estimated at 47 years before major refurbishment required. The weapon remains fully operational, she concluded, ready to fire on 24 hours' notice, all systems nominal. Someone asked about the debris field at the former location of Moncala, whether it posed a navigation hazard. Negligible, Maelis said. The debris has dispersed across a volume of space too large to interfere with hyperspace lanes. Within a decade, you won't even know a planet was there. Just another empty sector. She looked well rested. Cassivar Halton worked in the Symbol Maintenance Office for the next 11 years. He compiled reports. He verified that archived documents matched approved narratives. He ensured that any analysis questioning the Moncala demonstration's necessity was flagged and reclassified. He reviewed academic papers, intelligence assessments, even children's history texts, making sure the story remained consistent. He was good at his job, thorough, reliable. He never missed a discrepancy, never let a contrary narrative slip through. The official record remained clean, defensible, mathematically sound. Sometimes, late at night when the office was empty and the building settled into its quietest hours, he would pull up the original compliance projections, the models he'd built, the frameworks he'd designed, the parameters he'd established for target selection. They were still correct. Rebellion had remained mathematically irrational. The Empire was stable. Casualties from civil conflict had dropped to near zero across all sectors. Trade flowed smoothly. Industrial output increased year over year. The Death Star had achieved its objective. Deterrence was working. In year 14 after the demonstration, Cassivar received a routine memorandum. The Empire had identified another system requiring corrective action. Target, Alderaan. Population, 2 billion. Offence, suspected of harbouring rebel alliance leadership, providing material support to insurrectionist organisations, historical pattern of diplomatic resistance to imperial authority. Projected firing date, 6 weeks pending intelligence verification. The memorandum requested that he verify the target met established criteria and prepare documentation for post-event compliance analysis. Cassivar read the system profile. Alderaan, core world, senatorial representation until the dissolution. Peaceful, no military infrastructure, no shipyards, no weapons manufacturing, industrial output, minimal. Strategic significance, symbolic only. Evidence of organised rebellion, circumstantial, based on diplomatic communications and financial transfers that could be interpreted multiple ways. It didn't meet the original criteria, not even close. Moncala had been an industrial powerhouse actively arming resistance networks. Alderaan was a cultural centre that talked too much in diplomatic channels. The threat profiles weren't comparable. He drafted a response noting the discrepancy. He outlined alternative approaches, diplomatic isolation, economic sanctions, targeted arrests of suspected rebel sympathisers. He recommended against activation, used his original framework, the one he'd spent 4 hours perfecting 6 years ago, to demonstrate that Alderaan failed to meet the minimum thresholds for planetary suppression. The logic was sound. The mathematics were clear. This wasn't prevention. This was escalation. He filed the response and waited. His response was classified as advisory opinion and archived without action. The automated response arrived within minutes. Your input has been recorded for historical reference. Operational timeline unchanged. 6 weeks later, the system was annihilated. Cassivar watched the tactical feed from his office. Alderaan lasted 3.8 seconds after the superlaser fired. Slightly longer than Mon Cala. Something about the planetary composition creating marginally higher cohesion. Compliance indices increased across neighbouring sectors. 3 more systems pledged renewed loyalty within hours. The core worlds, which had been showing signs of discontent, went silent. No more diplomatic protests. No more senatorial challenges. The Empire remained stable. Cassivar compiled the post-event analysis as requested. The report was 43 pages, supported by 218 pages of statistical appendices. He noted the deviation from original targeting criteria, recommended updating the framework to reflect current operational parameters, suggested that continued divergence from established protocols could undermine the weapon's deterrent legitimacy. He filed it in the appropriate archive section. 3 days later, he received a response from Varkesh Maloon. Your observations regarding framework deviation have been noted. However, strategic doctrine has evolved to meet operational realities. The original parameters were designed for a galaxy with active rebellion. We now operate in a galaxy with compliant terror. Thresholds have adjusted accordingly. No further analysis of targeting criteria is required. The numbers were still correct. The model still showed net positive outcomes. Fewer deaths from suppressed conflict. Higher. Compliance. Greater stability. Except the models had been written for a different weapon. For a weapon designed to fire once. For a deterrent, not an instrument. The Empire no longer needed architects. It needed the weapon. And the weapon needed targets. Year 16. 3 more worlds. Failing to meet quotas was reclassified as resistance. Diplomatic protest was reclassified as rebellion. Cultural incompatibility with imperial values became a valid targeting criterion. Year 18. 5 worlds. 1 was destroyed because it produced literature the Emperor found subversive. Another because a local governor wanted to eliminate a rival. The justifications grew thinner, more abstract, more obviously pretextual. Cassivar compiled the reports, all of them, verified the numbers, maintained the archives, flagged contrary analyses, kept the official narrative consistent. The mathematics said it was working. Compliance was at all-time highs. Rebellion was statistically non-existent. The Empire had never been more stable. He'd been right. His models had never lied. Order preceded justice. Always had. Always would. This was the system he had designed. This was prevention. This was fewer deaths. This was inevitable. Cassivar Halton sat in his office on sub-level 67, surrounded by archives of worlds that no longer existed, and began preparing his next compliance report. The numbers were still correct. He'd been right all along.